to Be Bold America. Our program today is From Ronald to Donald, How the Myth of Reagan Became the Cult of Trump. As today's guest says, quote, the Reagan presidency was the springboard into our current political, economic, and cultural era. Call it what you will, the DNA of Reagan's economic policies lives on some 40 years later. Throughout Reagan's 8 years in the Oval Office, Ronald Reagan was largely successful in shaping the soul of America to reflect his durable mantra that government is the problem. That same American soul later embraced Donald Trump, a president who, arguably, would have appalled Reagan. The myth of Ronald Reagan far outshone and has outlasted his 8 years in the Oval Office. It became the gossamer framework on which the modern-day Republican Party transformed the Gipper's hopeful, if gauzy, message of morning in America into the small-minded rancor of Donald Trump's MAGA. Our bold guest today makes the case that understanding the mythology at work is a necessary step toward healing American politics and saving American democracy. We have big things to do. Our interview guest is attorney Ed Oswald. Ed is a lawyer with an expertise in the federal taxation of municipal bonds. He is a partner in an international law firm in Washington, D.C. Ed is a frequent lecturer and speaker on financing infrastructure for state and local governments and nonprofit organizations. Ed served as an attorney advisor at the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Tax Legislative Counsel during the second term of the Clinton administration, where he worked on tax policy matters impacting U.S. public infrastructure. At the U.S. Treasury, he worked with the IRS, SEC, White House staff and economists, House Ways and Means Committee, and the Senate Finance Committee. Welcome to Be Bold America, Ed.
Well, thank you very much, Jill. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to have you. Ed, you begin your book with Reagan's mantra that government is the problem. He also said, the 9 most terrifying words I ever heard was, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Yeah, what I'd like to do is just start and very briefly share with you my career experience that became one of the reasons why I wrote my book, America Abandoned. And because those words mean a lot to me when I read them, the government is the problem when I read them. And I worked for 3 Bay Area cities, and I began my career before Reagan. And we had town hall meetings. We worked with the public on projects, built parks, swimming pools, or, variety of different city issues. And for those 7 or 8 years before Reagan was president, we worked very well with the public. We felt that we were partners together because that was when being a public servant was an honorable profession. And then when he said those 9 most terrifying words, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, and by the way, I was there to help, but when he said that, I quickly saw a shift in the public to where years later you get yelled at meetings, I pay your taxes. We were always reminded by our city managers that you work for everyone, not people screaming at you in the room. It just, when I looked at my career, where it started and where it ended, that mantra that you talk about, that durable mantra, government is a problem, really affected me personally. So I wanted to get your views on all of that.
Yeah, well, Jill, thank you for that comment. And, I feel very much the same. As you know, we start off chapter 1 in the book really focusing on that phrase which was said during his first inaugural speech, January 20, 1981. I think it really did change the paradigm of America in many ways. Obviously, not overnight, but it laid the seed corn, if you will, for minimizing government. Anyone who worked in government is in some jargon, either an elitist or a bureaucrat. If government is the problem, then why do we need to fund it adequately? Why do we need to have a level of expertise? By definition, if government is a problem, our taxes are being wasted, et cetera, et cetera. that's really the one transformative effect, I think, of the Reagan presidency, where he really, in many ways, changed the culture of the country. And that phrase, to me, was really lightning in a bottle for what was to come.
Yes, and it divided us. That was the beginning for me of dividing Americans to dislike others. And who benefits from that mantra?
If you combine that with some of Reagan's economic policies, which I know we'll talk about, I think that division really does benefit ultimately, if you think about it selfishly, the upper economic strata of U.S. society. That if government is the problem, we'll just cut taxes because they're almost by definition wasted. And the way we'll cut taxes, which won't be intuitive to anyone, the tax cuts will be all weighted towards the wealthy, which is the definition of supply-side economics. So in many ways, that is the cover for what is to come, which was really the rollout in the beginning of the Reagan presidency.
Right, and you also talked about it being, his tax cuts being the centerpiece of his 1980 campaign for the presidency. And then 40 years later, Donald Trump honored that legacy by signing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act into law, which you say was the largest overhaul of the tax code the country had seen since Reagan.
It was. The notion of supply-side economics or trickle-down economics or Reaganomics, as you know, Jill, it goes by many phrases.
Yes.
It all began in 1981, more or less a fringe theory, and it really was a fringe theory that part of Reagan's 1980 campaign was, one, as you say correctly, government is the problem. Two, everything will just be better if we cut taxes, etc. So Reagan's 1981 Tax Act still remains the largest in U.S. history. He had two major tax acts, 1981, 1986. Massive tax cuts, again, with the primary beneficiaries being the upper income brackets, which we can talk more about. And that was really baked into then the soul of the GOP. That tax cuts are the only way to propel the economy. And by the way, tax cuts pay for themselves is part of the jargon, which is not true. And then that was later picked up by George W. Bush, very large tax cut. And you're correct, followed up later by Donald Trump in 2017, another large tax cut, but all modeled along what President Reagan had done.
Well, when I first heard back in the 80s the phrase trickle down, I just had to laugh. Who would believe this? And yet people did. And I have to apologize when I bring this next up in supporting this topic here. I got to your chapter 10, Taxes, Big Government, Middle Class Despair, and I didn't get a chance to finish it, so maybe you discuss this. And what I wanted to also bring up at the same time was what Jude Wanniski had created, his grand plan of the two Santa Clauses, because he was a conservative commentator and was an associate editor of the Wall Street Journal, but he left when it had been discovered that at a New Jersey train station, he's distributed leaflets supporting a Republican senator candidate, which was considered an act of ethics violation then. But Jude Wanniski created the two Santa Clauses plan, which Reagan adopted in 1981. And it's still alive and well. And what it is the first Santa, the strategy is that when Republicans control the White House, they must spend money like a drunken Santa and cut taxes on the rich, all to intentionally run up the U.S. debt as far and as fast as possible. Then the second Santa is when Democrat is in the White House, Republicans scream about the national debt as loudly and frantically as possible, freaking out about how our children will have to pay for it. You must cut spending to solve the crisis. And this started during Reagan's presidency and just tripled down on the following presidents of Bush and Trump with massive tax cuts for billionaires. Wanniski's script, Republicans always squeal about the national debt and saying they will refuse to fund government and possibly crash the economy, shut the government down, can't help children, no money for Head Start or Social Security, or, on and on. Politically, I think it was a brilliant strategy that was hatched by someone people have really never heard of, Jude Wanniski.
Yes, well said. That is true, and he worked with economist Arthur Lafleur.
Oh, right, the Lafleur, yes.
The famous Lafleur curve, where, yes, and the theory being that you can cut taxes to some degree, and as you cut taxes to some degree, that will increase tax revenues. Yes, I know. It is. It's I'm not. You're never quite sure whether to laugh or cry when I discuss these topics. But the reason why Reagan is so captivating is really, in many ways, what you described there is that the notion of massive tax cuts, the kind of lie, if you will, that tax cuts pay for themselves, all began really with the Reagan administration. When Eisenhower was president, the highest marginal tax rate was 90% or better. When Nixon was president, the highest marginal tax rate was 70% or better. And just for your audience, the notion of marginal tax rate means that obviously you don't pay your income tax is based on either 90% or 70% in whole. It's based on a margin, and that margin would make you, in today's world, a millionaire or multimillionaire, that you would pay tax at a high rate on that increment. Republicans really believed in balancing the budget. They believed in having the ledger pencil out. And the notion of tax cuts being in many ways a political weapon, as you're highlighting, really began with Reagan. And as you say, within the culture of the GOP, continues to this day.
Well, we now have ended up with the greatest wealth and income inequality in the developed world, as over 50 trillion, 50 trillion was transferred from the bottom 90% to the top 1% in 43 years.
That is true. There's this. We cite a lot of that in the book, and we have a lot of data that really goes to that point. And there's a Rand Corporation study that we cite, which is, I think, getting more and more, Jill, attention. But it's a study of the wealth and income transfer. Really, I'll say income from 1979 through 2019, and as you say, approximately $47 trillion in national income has been transferred over that 40-year span from the bottom 90% to the top 10% through trickle-down economics and this GOP philosophy. So in many ways, it's really, frankly, not trickle down. It's really trickle up. Right.
Definitely the opposite. And the middle class has gone from what? It was maybe at Reagan's time 60% of the population, and now it's down to 45 or something. Maybe you know the numbers.
Yeah, I think that's about right. As you know, the notion of middle class is always shifting to some degree.
Right.
But no one can dispute the wealth and income transfer. And I think in many ways, and many economists would agree as well, is basically an effective oligarchy right now between the have and have-nots. And I think, as we'll discuss more, I know some of that has given rise to Trump's popularity.
Oh, my. Well, this is a good time for a break. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. Our topic today is From Ronald to Donald, How the Myth of Reagan Became the Cult of Trump. Ed served as an attorney advisor at the U.S. Treasury Department Office of Tax Legislative Counsel during the second term of the Clinton administration, where he worked on tax policy matters impacting U.S. public infrastructure. At the U.S. Treasury Department, he worked with the IRS, SEC, White House staff and economists, House Ways and Means Committee, and the Senate Finance Committee. You may reach Ed at LinkedIn. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Did you know that 6 corporations own 90% of the media in the United States? Isn't it about time we own some too? KSQD 90.7 FM, your community radio station, your voice, your concerns. Go to www.ksqd.org to get involved and support locally owned grassroots community media. K-Squid, KSQD FM.
Hello, K-Squid listeners. I'm Tom Hartman, and each weekday at 4 p.m., I bring you a different perspective on the news than you're likely to hear on most media outlets. Please join me on KSQD Santa Cruz, your ink spot on the dial for the Tom Hartman program, heard now for the first time ever in the Monterey Bay area at 90.7 FM, weekdays at 4 p.m. That's Progressive Talking Conversation with me, Tom Hartman, weekdays at 4 p.m. on KSQD 90.7 FM. Tag, you're it.
And we're back. Would you like a friend to hear this interview on From Ronald to Donald, How the Myth of Reagan Became the Cult of Trump? Be Bold America is available as a podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, Breaker, Pocket Casts, Radio Public, and YouTube. Subscribe for free from your favorite podcast platform or listen on Be Bold America's homepage on the ksqd.org website. I also want to give a special shout out, of course, to our listeners in the U.S. and Canada, but especially to those in the United Kingdom, Austria, Ireland, and Algeria. Thank you so much for listening. Now, back to you, Ed. So how did the Reagan presidency become the springboard to our current political and economic and cultural era?
Well, the Reagan, great question. The Reagan presidency was certainly, I think, for the country transformative. And certainly an element of the book is we try to bring to the reader that by understanding the presidency of Ronald Reagan, we can understand how a transformative president creates far more than policy, but he can also shape culture, really, with the instrumental force of mythology. And I think Reagan, in many ways, changed the cultural gospel of the country through, really, the power of his personality and then elements of the policy he introduced. You know, as you know, Reagan was always known as the great communicator. Reagan had a very deep and wide skill set. He was in his career a successful radio broadcaster, a B actor in Hollywood, but nevertheless had a successful career. He made 51 movies in Hollywood. He had a long run in TV with GE Theater and other elements of TV. He was a 2-term governor, as you know, Jill, of California.
Yes, we have a rising homeless problem since that year. He put so many people out on the streets, and it's only gotten worse.
Yes, and as you know, he had a long alliance and relationship with General Electric, where he was the company spokesman. And Reagan talks about this in a number of his books, but for about 8 years or so, he was a GE spokesman, and as part of that role, he toured factory floors, sometimes visiting, as he said, up to 14 factories a day. And Reagan was an empathetic fellow, popular, and knew how to turn a phrase. He was a wonderful storyteller, again, in part through movies and TV. And I think given his interaction with blue-collar workers, union workers on the GE floor, he really developed a very strong skill set in terms of how to engage Americans. You might recall, Jill, when he was elected first in 1980, we spoke about the Reagan Democrats and how, again, it may be antithetical in other years for Democrats to vote for a Republican, But, Reagan was different. Reagan was quite gifted. As
I wasn't one of them, by the way. I wasn't one of them.
Yeah, let the record reflect.
Yes.
So Reagan not only tried to, I think, educate people who listened to him, but he tried, I think, to make you see the world the way he did. And the way he saw the world was taxes are too high, government is the problem, tax cuts pay for themselves. And as you know, part of the Reagan agenda at that point was also to, increase military spending quite significantly. Now, importantly, as you know, his to-be vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, heard Reagan's pronouncements and policies, as you might recall, called them voodoo economics.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make sense how you can increase defense spending, cut taxes, etc., and otherwise, as Reagan said, I'm also going to balance the budget.
And he was right. You couldn't do it.
Yes, that is true. But he was, one, incredibly persuasive. Two is, to your point earlier, he's really playing the role of Santa Claus there. Mm-hmm. Someone saying, I'm going to cut your taxes, the average American is not going to argue with that.
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy Carter, as you recall, asked for sacrifice. He asked for moderation. He said Americans want honest answers, not easy answers. And sadly, a lot of the Reagan campaign, a lot of the Reagan campaign in 79, 80 was really premised on easy answers.
Easy answers, that's right.
It really was.
Well, you said in your book, too, I thought this was very insightful, and I'll read the sentence. But the more valuable lesson he had learned, Reagan, beyond memorizing his lines and addressing the camera, was the power of simple, one-dimensional, canned portrayals of simple, one-dimensional, canned characters who exhibited simple, one-dimensional, canned values.
Thank you for reading that, yes. I think that is true. I think that, translates well within American society. And arguably Trump plays that tune as well. It's simple. It's one-dimensional. Obviously, the character of Trump and Reagan are quite different. But Reagan, at least on the public stage, never came through as complicated. He came through as middle America. He came through with, I have common sense answers. Now, we know the world is complex, but that's not the way Reagan positioned himself with the public, and that sold very effectively.
It's that bumper sticker mentality. You also talk about Reagan was originally a FDR New Deal Democrat and then became this right-wing Republican. Tell us about that transition.
Yeah, Reagan's family, his father, were really lifelong Democrats. Oddly enough, Reagan's political idol, really his whole life, was FDR. And he really did borrow a lot of the stagecraft that FDR used during his presidency. Reagan grew up, I'll say, somewhat poor. His father was an alcoholic. His father was a shoe salesman. As we lay out in the book, Reagan moved quite often as a young man until he ultimately settled in Dixon, Illinois. Part of the New Deal program gave his father a job. I think that Reagan, growing up in the Depression, realizing that FDR's New Deal programs kept a roof over their head, felt, I think, a strong allegiance and alliance to FDR, who again remained his political idol. I think as Reagan became more successful, he, for a person coming from Dixon, Illinois, to make it to Hollywood, California, was really quite a remarkable journey. Reagan became wealthy. Reagan, when he married Nancy Davis, her father was a gentleman named Dr. Loyal Davis. Dr. Loyal Davis was a renowned conservative and, importantly, a very good friend of Barry Goldwater. And as you know, Reagan later became a big Goldwater supporter.
Right.
So it was really a transformation. I can't say, Jill, that was all economic, but I think being exposed to GE, being a successful person economically, having the influence of Nancy Davis's father, and frankly, as Reagan's first book was written in 1965, it's called Where's the Rest of Me? And even in 1965, there's a narrative in there about Reagan complaining about the progressive income tax, et cetera. So it had grown on him over the years.
And he also became president of SAG. I forget what Screen Actors Guild is. Thank you.
Yes.
And I guess the union members went on strike while he was president. I think, didn't that change his whole outlook on unions? And so then he went into union busting, as he did with firing all the air traffic controllers?
Yeah. It's Reagan's Hollywood years as a SAG, as you say, union leader. And he's actually, to this date, I think the only member of a union who is also president of the United States. And as you point out, later on in 1981, 82, fired all the air traffic controllers, which I know many of your listeners might remember, which really set the stage for union busting during his two terms. I think there are a couple things going on when Reagan was in Hollywood and president of the Screen Actors Guild. One is that there was infiltration of communism at that point, allegedly within movies, within some of the unions, that I know, rubbed Reagan the wrong way ultimately. But Reagan initially was really focused on fascism after World War II, not so much communism, but then later, really focused on both elements. There was, as you say, there were very violent strikes at that time. And also, I think that over time, Reagan saw an encroachment, even at that time, by the federal government, in the movie business. As you might recall, at one point, if you were in the movie production business, you could also own the theaters. And later there was an antitrust decision made that had split up the theaters from the movie production business. And I think Reagan saw the hand of government more and more in interfering in free enterprise, as well as just the swirl of some communist infiltration within the union movement and so forth that over time I think moved him to the right, together with the other influences I mentioned. But it was not linear. I think there were many stops and starts, and ultimately around 1960, Reagan becomes a Republican.
Before we take our next break, I wanted to do a little rant, which is, government. Government is really only as good or bad as those who are elected and hired to implement it. And I really see our society like a three-legged stool. That government, nonprofits, and I put in the religious nonprofits in that as well, and private sector. And I don't want government to make my cars or make my jeans or my popcorn, those sorts of things. But I do want government to be able to help me breathe clean air and drink clean water. And when I flush the toilet, I don't have to worry about where it goes. And then, and then there's the private sector, nonprofits, churches. And so what they've been doing over these 40 years is sawing off one leg of the stool. And what happens when you sit down on a two-legged stool? You're going to crash. You're going to fall to the floor. And I just wanted to point out that we need to think in terms of those three organizations and businesses, everybody working together that way to make our country actually function. You're listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. Today's bold guest is Ed Oswald, who is a lawyer with an expertise in the federal taxation of municipal bonds. He is a partner in an international law firm in Washington, D.C. Ed is a frequent lecturer and speaker on financing infrastructure for state and local governments and nonprofits. We will be right back after Jim Hightower's commentary titled, The GOP's New Plan to Enrich the Super Rich Again.
Excellent news, people. Republican officials are mounting an all-out political push for a massive cut in our taxes next year. Well, by our taxes, they don't mean yours. Rather, here they come with another absurd sob story about giant corporations and the super wealthy suffering unbearably from excessive taxation. Feeling the pain of these multi-billionaires, the GOP is riding to their rescue, promising to extend the trillion-dollar tax boondoggle Donald Trump handed to the rich in 2017, and vowing to add an extra $1 trillion worth of new breaks for them. Ludicrously, the lawmakers, lobbyists, and corporate front groups pushing this garish plutocratic giveaway loudly insist that the real beneficiaries are not the privileged few, but cue the patriotic music, America. Lowering taxes on the corporate rich, they exclaim, will let those elites invest more in new jobs and enterprises, expanding the economy for all. Of course, that's the same ball of dung they keep rolling up Capitol Hill again and again. And it gets stinkier every time, especially now that monopolies control everything from high-tech and healthcare to oil and food prices. Why reward them? Far from creating jobs, they're automating them. And rather than increasing competitiveness, monopolies buy up or squeeze out competitors. Plus, if they get another tax windfall, the oligarchs will just use it to jack up their stock prices, artificially making them richer and more dominant over us. This is Jim Hightower saying another gotcha in the GOP's giveaway would gut the IRS's ability to investigate and prosecute these filthy rich scofflaws who annually cheat us out of billions of dollars they owe for the upkeep of America. For information and action on this massive ripoff, go to AmericansForTaxFairness.org. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is made possible by you subscribers to Jim Hightower's Lowdown on Substack. Find us at jimhightower.substack.com.
Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation from Ronald to Donald, how the myth of Reagan became the cult of Trump, with our bold guest, attorney Ed Oswald. Now, Ed, after hearing Jim Hightower's commentary or my rant on the three-legged stool, do you have any comments on any of that?
You know, I do. I thought it was an excellent, your point, and then the commentary I think was excellent, at least in terms of, you know, where we're heading in 2025. Given the, again, more supply-side tax cuts by Trump in 2017, given the way they were passed, they were done under a technique called reconciliation, which means that many of them were not permanent and they are expiring next year.
Is that for just the middle class, or is it for the uber rich as well?
Well,
I thought some lasted and some didn't. And I thought it was
correct.
the middle class that didn't.
Yeah, see, you're exactly right. So the corporate tax rate is a permanent change. And again, nothing, I'll say because I live in Washington, nothing is permanent in Washington. But to your point, that was a permanent exchange and not intended to expire. But many of the individual tax rates, and again, it's somewhat diabolical how they put this together because there'll be political pressure all around to extend this in some way. But many of the individual tax rates from the middle class to the higher brackets will all expire by 12/31/2025. So next year is going to be the year of tax discussions. It's going to be front and center, and I think that's why the upcoming elections mean so much, because if in fact the Republican Party gets a clean sweep, we can certainly expect many of those supply-side tax cuts from 2017 to be extended. And again, just the nature of those tax cuts are all weighted towards the upper brackets. So, yeah, I think for folks listening, that will be a center of activity next year. And for that reason, among others, is really why the upcoming elections is so pivotal, they'll have a big impact on upcoming tax policy.
When we're talking about corporations, something came up in my mind, which was I don't know what the name of the law that was eliminated that allowed then corporations to buy back their stock. I mean, I think FDR put in place a law that kept them from doing that, and they could lower their taxes by reinvesting in their company and in their employees. And then something that was taken away, and now they're not incentivized to do that. Can you help me out here and tell me what that was that allowed them to buy back their stock and make themselves richer?
Yeah, I have to say I don't know offhand. As you know, there's been really so much financial deregulation over the last really 4 decades. Frankly, by Democratic administrations also. It's just much easier, as you note, for companies to buy back their stock, which ultimately increases their share price. But again, that's in many ways, there's actually parts of the book that just talk about the financialization of America, which again all began more or less in 1980 when we stopped making a lot of things and basically started to trade paper. Again, that's an exaggeration, but I think, Jill, what you're highlighting is, again, just more elements of the financialization of America.
It wasn't the Sherman Antitrust Act that I'm thinking of, but Reagan also stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1982, which was the act that kept monopolies from being created. And so now we've got huge monopolies. You don't even know the names of the companies that own all these fast food restaurants, that sort of thing. So that was another thing that he did.
Yes, he was certainly, a proud advocate of deregulation, of the so-called invisible hand that the market knows better. Obviously, that's a phrase from Alan Greenspan as well.
Also a lie.
And then the notion of regulated capitalism somewhat went out the door in 1981, somewhat brought back by Clinton, somewhat brought back by Obama. But what I've said to a number of groups I've spoken to about the book, and just really where some of the political dynamic is today. It's very difficult, I think, one, given the culture of America at the moment, for the Democratic Party to be talking about balancing the budget, and in order to do that, we need to raise taxes. Now, that's obviously true, and the wealthy have to pay their fair share, and taxes are historically low. And a lot of this all comes from, obviously, Reagan and the aftermath. But when one party, picking up on your phrase, really is playing the role of Santa Claus, I'm the GOP, I will cut your taxes, vote for me, versus the Democratic Party that says the deficit is now $34 trillion, that the cost of interest on that debt right now equals the U.S. defense budget of $864 billion, and soon will, believe it or not, surpass the U.S. defense budget, which is the largest defense budget on the planet.
In the world, yes.
Yeah. Now, that's reality. That is math. That is 2 and 2 is always 4. But if one party doesn't believe in math and science and the other one does, and you want to be elected and you want to govern the country, it's a very uneven playing field right now. And I think that's very unfortunate for the citizens at large. What really creates a strategic gambit, strategic mission that is very difficult for the Democratic Party to really speak truthfully about some of the hard choices we face down the road.
Well, one of the topics that we discuss on this program quite often is the climate crisis. And I only see that it can be solved through coordinated governmental legislation and regulation, that horrible word, which in fact, let's just talk about regulation, which is really rules. And it's rules. Nobody would play baseball without rules or football without rules. But the Republicans' position of destroying regulations is destroying the rules that protect us and them in some situations. So if government is viewed as a problem, the fate of humanity really is in peril. I know next week we might hear about the Supreme Court's decision on the Chevron versus the NRDC, where the government can't hire experts anymore, or courts defer to an expert. And we need experts when it comes to the climate emergency. So do you have any thoughts on, we need to get government coordinated in legislation and regulation to save not just this planet, but ourselves. The planet will be here, whether we are or not.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we talk about that in the book. There's a chapter in the book later on called Under Reagan's Shadow. And it's a little bit of what we started off with, Jill. It's kind of a little bit of the national amnesia, as I would refer to as, how the country was before the election of Reagan. And, how in many ways how we still live under the shadow of Reagan and a number of fictions. Government is the problem. Tax cuts for the wealthy will cure economic ills. Tax cuts pay for themselves, etc. And really, and we do talk in the book about the climate crisis, and that by necessity is a government role and government regulation. And government has to take charge of that because it's not something that can be undertaken by the private sector. I guess we're somewhat emphatic about the book about informed citizenry, that citizens take these things more seriously, that they think about not only themselves but the future generation and the grandchildren, and that politics is not entertainment. Politics should be boring. Politics should be sober. Get your entertainment somewhere else. But it really is in that chapter, Jill, in the last chapter, where it's titled "The Chickens Come Home to Roost." And we talk more and more about the legacy of 1980, 81, and Reagan, and so forth. There's just try to point people in the right direction, because I think it really does. Change at the top will only come through change at the bottom.
Well, and you talk about an informed citizenry, and I need to go to a break in a minute, but it's just, I don't know how we do that with so-called Fox News or 1,500 right-wing radio stations where that's all you get in the middle of the country and in the South. There are such propaganda channels that people really don't know the truth and think the exact opposite. And this concerns me very much because the progressive or the climate crisis, the science doesn't get out there. They've created people who don't believe in science. And so this is very concerning when you have a media that dominates so much of the country that isn't connected to the truth at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree with all that. It's really, in many ways, a challenge of our time, as I think wealth and inequality is an equal challenge.
Yes, thank you. If you're just joining us, my bold guest today is attorney Ed Oswald. Ed served as an advisor to the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Tax Legislative Counsel during the second term of the Clinton administration, where he worked on tax policy matters impacting U.S. public infrastructure. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
What's up, Squid family? This is DJ Dupsy, inviting you to join us this month for the Sunday dinner, where we dedicate this episode to my mother. My buddy DJ Cold T will be joining us again as we play some music and share some memories. Join us Sunday, June 16th from 6 to 7 p.m. on K-Squid, 90.7 FM, 89.5 FM, and 89.7 FM KSQT Prunedale. You can also stream live at ksqd.org. It's food for the thought and food for the soul on the Sunday dinner.
Ed, in these last few minutes, I'd like to ask what ideas you might have for us to keep doing, stop doing, start doing, for us to take actions that relate to our discussion today. Our future depends on it. You mentioned that understanding the mythology at work is a necessary step towards healing American politics and saving American democracy. So how can we, in your view, heal American politics and save our American democracy with knowing about Reagan's legacy, his Reaganomics, and the cult of Trump?
Well, thank you for that question. I think I would begin responding to that. I had an interesting interaction a few weeks ago, and I was speaking with a group of, I'll say, never Trumpers. This is a Republican group who really would not vote for Trump, but these people were really, Reaganites.
They're conservatives, right?
Yes, that was their beacon, and it was a well-informed group, postgraduate degrees, etc. But I started to talk a little bit about Reagan and the continuum from Ronald to Donald, and asked them why they felt so strongly about Ronald Reagan. And I told them that Reagan not only cut taxes, but he actually raised taxes several times. And that was really a surprise to the audience. Reagan raised taxes in 82, 83, 84, and 86, and among others. So they didn't know that Reagan actually raised taxes. They thought Reagan just cut taxes. So if Reagan is your beacon, if Reagan is your shining star, well, Reagan said it was okay to raise taxes, and he in fact did so. The other thing I said to them is that we think about the Reagan myth as Reagan the tax cutter, Reagan the deficit hawk, Reagan the champion of small government. I said that in terms of Reagan the conservative, did you know that when Reagan was president, the national debt, which is now $34 trillion, but the national debt when he took over from Jimmy Carter was $1 trillion. And Reagan spoke of that $1 trillion as a massive amount in his campaign speeches and worried whether we'd ever be able to pay it back. And did you know that at the end of the Reagan presidency that started with $1 trillion of national debt, he left office with almost $3 trillion of national debt. He ran the deficit up from $1 trillion to $2.8 trillion.
Well, that's the first Santa Claus. That's
Indeed. So people in my group, Jill, were very surprised of that, and I, again, began to unfold the Reagan myth, the Reagan legacy, and many of them didn't appreciate that because they were caught up in the myth, and the myth still captivates the GOP. So one small step I tried to make there is really write this book to illuminate the myth and how we're stuck in the shadow of the myth. I think emphatically, as we move into this year, in terms of what to do, is to pay attention to the election, pay attention to Biden's strong sentiment and desire to stay within NATO, how NATO has been expanded, how Biden is talking about having the wealthy pay their fair share, and he is really trying to, in many ways, reset the table and get us away from supply-side economics and back towards where the country was pre-1980. Now, that is a very big hill to climb, as you know, but at least where we have been over the last several years with Joe Biden, the reset that I was hoping that Clinton would do and Obama would do hasn't happened. And at least I think Joe Biden is making a very large attempt at trying to equal the playing field that has been so unequal for many years.
So just to recap for us, when you talk about the myths, I know we've talked about them through the hour, but just to recap, what are those myths that we need to keep in mind to understand? One is the trickle down, which didn't work. In my view, one's the two Santa theory, where Republicans get in, run up the debt, and then when the Democrats get in, scream bloody murder. We can't do any social programs. But what else to recap there? Sure.
So the elements of, I think, the Reagan myth, thank you, were multifaceted. Again, it's, Reagan the tax cutter, one-dimensional. Reagan the deficit hawk. Reagan the promoter of deregulation. As you said earlier, regulation is necessary to protect us all. Reagan the promoter of traditional family values. Reagan the champion of small government. We talked about how government needs to be adequately funded. The champion of free market capitalism. Reagan is also, as the myth is, the victor of the Cold War. Obviously, that was a 50-year trajectory of both Democrat and Republican Party to basically beat the Soviet Union without firing a shot. But a lot of it falls within, within the myth of Reagan, if you will. And I think part of the myth as well, Jill, is that the only way to propel the economy forward are tax cuts. And we know that that's not how you move the country forward. We know that tax cuts explode the national debt. We know that tax cuts don't pay for themselves. And that's a primary myth as we go into the election season, because we're going to hear from the GOP all about tax cuts once again.
Well, you also talked about from government is the problem to drain the swamp. It's creating mistrust among the American public. What do we need to start doing to start trusting again?
Well, everyone needs government. Government is in your life every day. It's your public schools, it's your infrastructure, it's your highways, it's your mass transit, it's your airplanes.
It's your sewage system.
Yeah.
It's the potholes in the street. Yeah.
Yeah. So, a paradox here is that although Reagan ran against big government, Trump ran against the swamp and the deep state, Americans love big government. They like big government. They like all the services that government provides. And they like the two big twins of big government, Social Security and Medicare. People like all these programs. So this rhetoric we hear on the right about government is the problem, it's not the problem. In many ways, it's the solution. And frankly, if you think about it, it's the solution you rely on every day of your life as well as your children.
Well, I think you have written a brilliant book, Ed, with your co-author, Alan Axelrod. And I really encourage people to take a look at these last 40 to 50 years that are covered in this book. There's another one that I like as a keep, stop, start, maybe people might want to read, is Michael Lewis's book called The Fifth Risk, because it was an insightful work and a testament to the unsung heroes that go unnoticed in the unglamorous business of government. And, there are a lot of people working like I was years ago that want to help, that feel a call to service, and they don't know who, we don't know who they are. And yet they're there every day and night, 24/7, working to keep our local, state, county, state, and federal governments working. And I want to build more respect for them as well. So, Ed, thank you for being our bold and impressive guest today. It was delightful to talk with you. Thank you for giving us a valuable hour of your attorney time and opening our eyes to Reagan's mythology that has really, it's like a brand now, and we really need to start being aware of how we're being manipulated by it.
Jill, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to speak with you and be a part of your program. Thank you so much for having me.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you, Ed. What's up next on Be Bold America? Please join us on Sunday, June 30th for the Cancel Culture Curse. Cancel culture is an insidious force in our society today. In the seconds it takes to make one regrettable social media post or wind up on the wrong side of a false accusation or misunderstanding, reputations, relationships, and careers are destroyed. How did we enter an era when people cannot make mistakes, when no apology or change of heart can ever bring about forgiveness? Making a comeback used to be celebrated as an American ideal, but have the roads to redemption been permanently blocked by internet mobs seeking vengeance? In his book, The Cancel Culture Curse, Evan Neerman, founder and CEO of Red Banyan, an international crisis management and public relations firm, will discuss the global crisis and the impact of cancel culture in today's media-driven world. Evan Neerman will also explore the history of cancel culture and the trends that have fostered it, defining the telltale elements that are hallmarks of such campaigns. So, please join Be Bold America on Sunday, June 30th at 5 p.m. to hear the Cancel Culture Curse. As a reminder, Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Now you may listen to the show anytime for free by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. Also, you may reach me anytime at info@ksqd.org. I want to give a special thank you to our talented Be Bold American program engineer, Eliza James, and to our station's tireless program director, Howard Feldstein. You are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz and KSQD Brundale, Many Voices, One Station. Listen worldwide online at ksqd.org. And stay tuned for Sunday Dinner. My name is Jill Cody, and thank you for listening to Be Bold America. Until next time, keep, stop, start.